Welcome back, rock and rollers, friends, degenerates, trolls, music lovers, guitar players. Welcome back to the Thirsty Deer Studio. And I've got a video for you tonight that's a passion project of mine. It's not the usual music production or guitar video that I do on here about my music. We're going to talk about one of the main reasons that I play guitar, Mike Campbell, and his new book, Heartbreaker. This is a great autobiography. I've read so many great bios and autobiographies from singers, guitar players, even managers, anybody connected to the music business or doing music I love. I try and read the books. I've read Keith's biography, autobiography, Steven Tyler's, Ron Wood's, one's on the Dead, one's on Jim Morrison, on Jimi Hendrix. I've got Flea's autobiography back there. I want to do one on Scott Weiland's book. All of these people that are really the reason I play music, and I will say right from the beginning, getting near completion of this book was a very emotional thing. When he started talking about some of the troubles Tom had and how hard things got, but also was still like that last tour was really great, except for Tom being in pain. Mike said it was, one of his best times in the band. But I want to look at this from the angle too, because this is a music production channel, and another of my favorite people in music production and the music he did with ELO, Jeffrey Lynne. Mike talks about Jeffrey Lynne's way of production in this and how it was different from what they had been doing and yielded great results with Full Moon Fever and which was Tom's solo album, and the stuff with the Traveling Wilburys, and coming off of Long After Dark and Southern Accents. Those albums were done in a different way and difficult, so Jeffrey Lynne really gave them a breath of fresh air, and it's a totally different production technique, and one that's pretty similar to the way a lot of us do things, the way I do things, but I think there's some tips in this book when Mike talks about how Jeff did things that were interesting for me, and I want to talk about them. But I want to start when they first went out to LA and the way they were getting music done when they first went out there, so I can show the contrast between that way and how Jeffrey Lynne did things. So when they were coming from Gainesville to Los Angeles, they had a big following in Gainesville. They were doing great, but they didn't have a record deal. They weren't on the radio yet. And the band wasn't the Heartbreakers yet. It had Mike Campbell and Ben Mont and Tom, but that was the extent of the Heartbreakers that were in the band. And another interesting person that was in Mudcrutch was Tom Leadon. This is Bernie Leadon, who was the guitar player for the Eagles when the Eagles first started. He did the kind of more country parts that the Eagles are known for in the beginning of their career, like Desperado and Witchy Woman and these kinds of twangy Telecaster and slide guitar parts. Bernie Leadon was very famous for that, and Tom Leadon, once he came out to LA with Mudcrutch after they broke up, he made a name for himself as well, playing guitar for other people. So Gainesville has a very rich history of great guitar players, great bands and musicians, all through the South. People like the Allman Brothers, Leonard Skinner. But when we talk about Gainesville specifically, Don Felder was from there also, and they all kind of knew each other. And Don Felder was kind of a mentor for guitar players. He was another guitar player in the Eagles all through the 70s, known for writing Hotel California, among other songs for the Eagles. And they very famously fought as well. So when they came out to LA, the band was Mudcrutch, and Tom very quickly started to create some buzz, but a lot of people were having Tom hang around to write songs like he was hanging out with Dylan and hanging out with Roger McGuinn and people like this, that you can hear his influence in Tom's songs, but they would keep him around, you know, to help with writing ideas, because everybody knew that Tom was spectacular even before he got famous. Just as soon as he hit the scene in LA, the studios were having him work. And a very important figure in this, another important figure in music production, is Denny Cordell. And I've watched like Behind the Musics with Tom. I believe it was the one for Damn the Torpedoes. And Tom talks about how when Denny first brought them there, the best thing he ever did for them was lock them in the studio till they got their sound right and their music production right, learned how to cut tape and do all these things that we don't even necessarily do today, but also things that we do today, like mic placement, how using the analog gear, and how that sound and that character can be used to great effect and to really push your songs and give them that extra energy. Compressors, all these things, you know, they learn just from being in the studio and working it out. And that's very much how the first 3 albums were done. Denny Cordell was the producer on that first project. Then, you know, he was still affiliated with the band, but they started having problems, money issues around the 3rd album. And Tom brought in Jimmy Iovine and Shelly Yakus, which Shelly is a legendary engineer. And they spent a huge amount of time getting Stan's drum sounds for Damn the Torpedoes. And this continued, this way of, you know, playing live on the floor all the way until Jeffrey Lynne came into the picture. And it was frustrating at times, because a whole lot of the time, from the way Mike talks in the book, because if one person's sound isn't right coming through the mics, that take is scrapped, you know. So the whole band can be, you know, hitting on all cylinders, and just one microphone or one person does something wrong and the whole take gets scrapped. Now, to some extent, you can overdub and do things like that, but they were very much into getting that live sound off the floor. So it's a difficult thing to get that working and get everybody and all those mics hitting right. You know, you don't have the isolation that you do when you're overdub tracking everything one piece at a time. And so that's a benefit, but there's also, you know, something about that energy when the mics are bleeding into each other and you have that sound coming through, you know, the cymbals bleeding into the bass cab microphone, things like this. It's just a different kind of energy and a different kind of sound, and very fucking rock and roll. You know, it's, like the sound we think of, if you think about the Heartbreakers, it's a lot of times room mics picking up everything. You know, like for Damn the Torpedoes, they recorded at Sound City. And if you've seen the Sound City documentary, Sound City was known for 2 things, basically. That great Neve board that Dave Grohl owns now with those 1084 mic preamps. I've also done a video on Rupert Neve and those 80 series consoles, so if you want to check that out, I'll put the link up here for you. It's another video that's done really well for the channel, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but the best video that I've had on this channel was actually a video I did called Mike Campbell Legend. It got a lot of subscribers for the channel and has done very well, so this is kind of like a follow-up in ways to that, which, you know, Mike is my man. You know, Mike, if you ever see this video, just know that you're the reason a lot of us play music. So, they were in Sound City, and it's known for those 80 series consoles, and maybe even more than that 80 series console. I think it's a 8028 or 8038. Even more than that console, it's known for the room, the drum sounds in that room. You know, albums like Rumors from Fleetwood Mac, a lot of those drum sounds were in there. just so many records. Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, all of these records were done because of that room and because of that Neve board. And so they're using the room to their advantage, and to use the room to your advantage, to get the most out of it, you want to live track the full band in there and get everybody in that room together. And Shelly was great on this. When they did Damn the Torpedoes, it became their best-selling album at that time and did really well for the band. And everybody, that kind of put Jimmy Iovine on the map, and he became, one of the biggest people in music. He worked with Dr. Dre later on, did so much in the music industry, made it all the way to the top, of record labels. And for Jimmy, Tom and Mike and the Heartbreakers were where his attentions were at, because he knew they had the songs. He knew what he had there with Tom, and not just with Tom, with Mike. He connected Mike when Tom rejected the song. He connected Mike with Don Henley for Boys of Summer. Mike went on, to do these side projects to get things rolling with other artists as well. To, when Tom Petty and Stevie Nicks did Stop Dragging My Heart Around, that was a Mike Campbell song. That was Mike Campbell's music. Mike did so much even on Tom's solo work, to get those sounds. Mike and Tom were like this. They came to LA together. Tom trusted Mike, and Mike wanted to serve Tom because he knew what a great songwriter he was. So that's a very important piece, because there was a lot of conflict with people with Tom, because Tom knew, it was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and he knew he had this thing that could be, brilliant in what Tom Petty became. And in the beginning, I think Mike was trying to navigate these waters, and he decided pretty early on that he also knew that Tom was this talent, this extraordinary talent, and he wanted to serve that. He just wanted to be around that. So he was going to do what it took to give Tom great songs and be there. And it was going to be the two of them and that band for the whole ride. And it's really inspiring to read that, because, egos play a lot and come into, they're a big factor with bands. They've been with me with bands, and it's just, it's hard to make things work if you let ego get involved. And when you're functioning at that high level that the Heartbreakers were, it would be even more difficult. And Mike decided, that he wanted to be there with Tom to do this, what they did, and the legendary songs that they wrote and things that they did, places they went. So they've been having all of these, rough sessions. It got even worse after Damn the Torpedoes. It just got more difficult. He talks about when they started producing Southern accents, other things were coming into play, things like cocaine, and it just got very hard to get things accomplished. And not too long, I think during those Southern accent sessions, Tom started, somehow him and Jeffrey Lynne got connected, and it does go into that as well. There was guitars changing hands back and forth with George Harrison and Bob Dylan and Tom, and that all led to the Traveling Wilburys and Jeffrey Lynne. And so Tom brought Jeff to Mike's house one day, because Mike had a recording studio at home. He's got a Neve board now, much like that one I was talking about at Sound City. I'm not sure what he had then. I would say they were at a point where he probably had that Neve at this point as well. But he talks early on about using, I think it's very early on, he had just a cheap reel-to-reel that he recorded demos on. But later on, I believe it was Tascam, maybe I'm wrong, but some reel-to-reel about like a Tascam. I think it was a 4-track that he did all these demos on. And so Tom brought Jeff over, and they started working. I'll put a picture of, this is actually Mike Campbell's garage. They had like the control room in the house and did all the instruments and tracking out in the garage, ran lines to the house, and they would go out there and just cut apart. And the way they were working was a piece at a time, and not even like how I do it, a piece at a time, where I'll go play a full drum part on a full drum kit. They were doing the snare drum, and then the cymbals, the hi-hat and the crash cymbals, and then they would do the kick drum and piece it together this way, very, specifically one piece at a time, which was crazy to me to hear that, because I've heard about like Eric Valentine recording Dave Grohl for Queens of the Stone Age with the drums up and no cymbals or electronic pads for cymbals, and then come back and overdub the cymbal parts later, because cymbals, unless you know how to play them in the studio, which I've gotten to where I know how to hit them now. I've recorded so much drums in here. It's a very different thing than recording guitars, because you have to be thinking about your touch and how hard you're hitting it all the time, because cymbals will bleed into everything, and you can have a great room mic sound, which I have 2 small diaphragm condensers up right here just off camera, and usually my best tom-tom sounds come from those mics. But if I hit the cymbals too loud, it ruins the track for, all the other drums. The snare and those great tom parts would get ruined by a hard crash cymbal hit, because for one thing, the crash cymbal carries over. You can't do any edits without the crash cymbal sounding crazy and chopped up. And if the crash is too loud, or the ride is too loud, or the hi-hat, it's gonna just, you can't crush the drum room mics like you normally would. You can't give them any kind of distortion. So Jeff was doing this a piece at a time, and Mike said it was like a breath of fresh air, because they had been struggling so much doing things live off the floor. Of course, later they went back to doing things that way as well, but this gave them a new way to look at music production. One thing that Mike talks about in this book that Jeff did that was different from really anything I've heard, was they were recording a snare drum part for one of those songs on Full Moon Fever, and went out to the garage, cut a track of snare drum, and it didn't fit for the song. It wasn't giving them the sound they wanted on the snare. And I think they did this a few times, and then Jeffrey Lynne told Mike to point the snare mics straight up at the ceiling. And Mike says he did that. Maybe they had 2 mics, because he does say mics. They probably had a bottom and a top snare mic, I would imagine, or maybe a room and a top and a bottom, some configuration of snare mics. And he pointed them up at the ceiling, and he said, just magically, there was that Jeffrey Lynne drum sound, like that from ELO records, like Do Ya and, Mr. Blue Sky. That snare drum sound comes from pointing the mics up at the ceiling for the snare drum. So I thought that was really interesting. And that right there is worth the price of admission for this video, if you ask me, because it's a different way to look at recording snare. I'm always experimenting in here, and that's one thing we're definitely going to try. It seems like a lot of work to record the drums piecemeal, individually, a piece at a time like that. I don't know if we'll do that, but I'm sure we'll get around to it at some point here, because it's all valid and all worth looking at, and definitely the results are there. Full Moon Fever is one of my favorite records, particularly the song Yer So Bad. I love that song. It's always been one of my favorite Tom Petty songs. When I was playing in bands, that was a song that I made sure we did, because I always dug that song. And unlike Free Fallin', it's a deeper cut on the album. Not as many people know it. It was an MTV video. I remember it. It was a pretty kooky video, pretty weird, but very Tom Petty and very cool. There was a blow-up doll in this video, and the song's about, a man being down on his luck in divorce, and It was kind of highlights of the 1980s in a paper. Very cool video. Go check out the Yer So Bad video after you get done watching this one. But, you know, Jeff just brought new life and new energy to the group. And then he worked on several projects with Tom, 2 Traveling Wilburys records. And Tom was going back and forth playing on stuff with Dylan and with George Harrison. And, you know, all these projects kind of intertwined, and Mike was a part of all that as well. Later on with Rick Rubin, they played for Johnny Cash. And then around that time in the 80s, they did 2 tours with Bob Dylan. Bob in his career, when he first went electric, he had the band, you know, Robbie Robertson, Lee Von Helm. That was his group of musicians. That was his band. They were called the Hawks before they were the band. Mike talks a little bit about this. That's some history that I already knew. And when I saw that the Heartbreakers were Dylan's backing band, that's what I thought as well. You know, Dylan can have whoever he wants playing with him, and that's the band he chose. And it kind of reminded me, and Mike drew that parallel as well, that it was kind of like when, you know, Dylan had the band, a great musician, Al Cooper on keyboards. He talks about Al Cooper talking to Benmont, and, you know, how he respected Benmont's playing, and how Benmont was a, you know, huge Al Cooper disciple. Al Cooper played the organ on Like a Rolling Stone, all these records. So there's just a lot of great history, stories. You know, Mike, it's not a scandalous book in any way, but Mike doesn't, you know, ignore things about drugs, you know, and all that. It's a great read. That Jeffrey Lynne production style, you know, it's a different kind of sound, and when you're overdubbing sounds like that, it gives you a lot of freedom on how you can edit things and what you can do to different tracks, especially when you're breaking it down to individual drums at a time and using room mics. You know, when you're recording guitars and things like this, you can put up room mics. It doesn't have to be all close mic things, and many times getting that room involved really gives you something great. You know, you don't have to use artificial reverbs as much if you have a good sounding room. This room is really cool because it might look like drywall is up there, but that's actually wood paneling on the walls in this room. That's why I decided to make this room my studio. Also, I have hardwood floors, and it's just, it's a real forgiving room for drums and guitar amplifiers. So the way that Jeff Lynne did this tracking, you know, a piece at a time, really was inspiring for me because it's how I work as well. And it got great results on analog tape back then, you know, and we can do so much more with editing now, you know, without having to have pieces of tape hung everywhere to splice tape together and things like this. You know, I knew to some extent that he worked like that. I didn't know that he broke it down to individual drums and individual sections, and just how, you know, it was really, you know, a piece and a part at a time, and then brought it all together at the end, you know, multi-tracking it, bouncing everything down, like things like we do here, to get a great sounding finished product. And it's a lot of work that goes into tracking like that. You know, if you can get it right, playing live off the floor, without having, you know, much problems, which I think, especially by reading this book, it can be hard to do, you know, when you're trying to achieve greatness, which we all should be trying to do. Greatness might be something that seems unattainable now. There's not very many, you know, ways to get a contract for putting out a record where you have a big budget. I don't think that's really a thing anymore unless maybe you're Taylor Swift or somebody. But we can do it ourselves, which it's a great time to be making music. And it's cool that they were doing things in that way, at least for that period of time in the mid to late 80s. He also talks about when Tom was working with Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. Dave, all these people that Tom brought in, whether it was just friends or because he was working on a solo project or doing things with the Heartbreakers, Mike was there for all of that. Tom trusted Mike, and Mike was there for Tom. And I think that speaks a lot about loyalty. This is just a great book, man, and I can't recommend it enough. So check out this book. Check out some of the music production stuff. Mike really gets pretty detailed. He talks about Neve boards in it. He talks about Jeffrey Lynne's production style. He talks about how he recorded things, the way he did things. He would track a piece at a time as well, because he was doing it all in his house. And his wife, Marcy, when they didn't have a lot of money, she pushed him to go ahead and buy that nice reel-to-reel tape recorder, because she knew that he was going to do great things with it. And, that's cool as hell too. So just a great book, a great read. I hope you all check it out. It's been great making this video. Like I said, another thing I wanted to talk about is Mike talks a lot about his guitars, and his first 3 guitars that, are still around. There was one that got broke, a Firebird, I believe. Tom sat on it. But the first 3 guitars were his Broadcaster, which I've got a 52 Tele, which is a lot like a Broadcaster. Of course, these are reissues. But then he had a 68 gold top. If you look over here, there's a gold top Les Paul with P90s, which mine's an R4. Those 68s were supposed to be like a 54 or 55 reissue, I believe, as well. And I didn't know at the time I got those guitars that those were Mike's 2 guitars. And I used to also have a 54 reissue Stratocaster. Mike had, I believe it was like around a 57 Strat that Tom used a lot as well. And those, he says, were the 3 main guitars. And it was just very coincidental that I didn't know. Of course, these are classic guitars. I saw Brian Jones using a P90 Les Paul like that on Rolling Stone's Rock and Roll Circus. It made me want that when I was 14. And then the Tele was a Keith Richards thing as well, but Mike also used those guitars, and I thought it was very cool that those are the guitars that I choose to make my music with, and the music that I love so much, the Heartbreakers music, was made with those guitars as well. Something very similar, the same models, just, an early version with the Broadcaster and a 68 reissue instead of a 95 reissue. So check out the book, give it a read. I'll be back with another video. I hope you dug this one. Hit like, subscribe, leave me a comment. Really, I'm trying to build this channel, get things growing. I love music. I know you all love music, or you wouldn't be watching. Hit that subscribe. Talk about the bands that mean something to you. If you have some great Mike Campbell stories or Heartbreaker songs that are important to you, leave them in the comments for me. I'll be back with another one real soon.